What's up, duelists? You already know what it is. You already know what it is. We had two RBET tournaments. If you haven't checked out those VODs, make sure and peep those before we get into this. But we gotta do a little refresh on the tier list, alright? There's been some pretty wild changes in Edison format since I made the last tier list, so gotta do it. And I'm definitely not just making this video because Dueling Book is down today. Just definitely not doing that. Anyway, if you guys aren't Anyway, if you guys aren't already subscribed, make sure and subscribe, leave a like, leave a comment for the algorithm, and let's just go ahead and get right into things. You know how we do with this tier list stuff. You know how we do. It's a little. You've seen the tier list before, all right? Let's be honest. Let's be honest. We got Ancient Gears. Let's start things off with Ancient Gears. Oh my, they're just gonna be massive. That's just how we're gonna have to do things, and then we're gonna resize it. Okay, that's doable. That's doable. Highest production quality tier list. Ancient Gears. I'll put them in B tier. I think it's a very good deck. It can kill you out of nowhere, but I think it's not as versatile as some of the other decks, and it does have a few really notable exploitable weaknesses. It has a lot of really strong stuff going for it, and it can kill you out of nowhere, which I think is the biggest thing. But it does struggle with dupe block a little bit too much. It struggles a little bit with Cyber Dragon in post board games a little bit too much, and it can struggle with just like a lot of trap cards. It doesn't play into back row as well as you think it might. It's a little dependent on its normal summon. If you don't have multiple copies of Gear Town, and then if you do have multiple copies of Gear Town, you're actually pretty weak to Royal Oppression. These are the biggest issues with the deck. The monsters are huge. They beat over everything. Limit removal is broken. Machina Fortress is broken. So I think it's a solid B tier deck, and I think that's probably where it'll end up being. You know, just overall long term. Honestly, you're gonna notice a trend. We might even need a second B tier here in a second. All right, next up we got Black Salvo. A lot of people like Salvo Dad. Salvo Dad is one of those decks that is terrible. It's just absolute garbage. It's like one of the worst synchro decks in the format because, you know, you're making level 7s, which first off, Dark Strike Fighter isn't legal in Edison format. So the only level 7 you really care to make is Black Rose Dragon. And usually if you want to make Black Rose Dragon, you want to be doing it off of Debris Dragon. You want to be doing it with Dandelion, get your tokens. This is a big issue for Salvo. However, I think if you're playing the list that I uploaded to the channel a few days ago, maybe a little over a week ago. If you're playing that list with Demise and what was it, Manju, Honest, Chaos Sorcerer, that list, now I think that list is very good. I think that list is a solid B tier deck as well. It might even be better than Ancient Gear, realistically. It's very resilient. It still has a few weaknesses like Ancient Gear does. It's a little weak to oppression, but if you can dodge that and you can also you know, just like dodge a few other random things like Vanity's Fiend, it's a really good deck. I think the issue with Salvo is that Dekoichi is a really bad and slow card going second. Going first, Dekoichi is really good. When you're playing the Demise stuff, not only do you solve a lot of the deck's issues with speed and dealing with you know, just like one or two established threats repeatedly, you also get access to a much faster Salvo in Advanced Ritual Art, sending Mechanical Chaser from your deck to the graveyard. All right, next up we got, well, I guess we should start things off with like pure Blackwings, like your original like Black Whirlwind Blackwings, your very standard 2010 list. I think this is going to go in a place that people might not expect. I've rated this deck very highly in the past, and there's a reason why I'm going to rate it this low. I think it's a B tier deck. As we move more towards the faster, like, sped up metagame that is like, okay, I can summon 3 times in a turn. What can your deck do? Sort of situation. Blackwings, in the traditional sense, where it's like very dependent on the normal summon, very dependent on Black Whirlwind, kind of a slower deck, honestly, in comparison to some of the other things that are happening. I think that the very standard stock lists are quite weak. They're quite weak in comparison to what the other decks are doing. They're very linear. If the normal summon gets cut off, oftentimes you have trouble like getting your footing, and that's a pretty exploitable weakness, especially with the rising trend of removal spells being able to answer normal summons. Like Phoenix Wing Wind Blast being like very common in almost every deck. All the discard traps, they beat up on Blackwings. Blackwings cannot deal with chainable discard traps, like picking off their oppression that they need to stick, picking off their normal summon that they need to stick. It's a very, very easy deck to pick apart when the common trap lineups destroy that sort of thing, and other decks just outpace it naturally if they don't draw the oppression. On the other hand, I do think that Blackwing Vayu is a solid approach to the Blackwing strategies. I think it's very strong. It won RBET1. It didn't have quite as good a showing in RBET2, but it is a solid deck. I think it's a very solid A tier deck. I'm a little hesitant to put it in S tier. It has some pretty big weaknesses, notably that it has a lot of bricks and the deck is kind of awkwardly slow. And if your graveyard gets interrupted and you don't draw like your burial, you can't really do much. It also has a few other weaknesses to some of the S tier decks we'll get into in a second. But I know these are two of the Blackwing decks that are most commonly played. I do want to talk about a third Blackwing variant. And the third Blackwing variant is these kind of hybrid decks we've been seeing. One of them top 8'd RBET2. It was playing kind of a combination between like Shura and Whirlwinds, and then it had Vayu and like main deck devastation stuff as well. It wasn't playing Raiko Kaya stuff. It wasn't playing that sort of thing. It was approaching it from a more unfair angle, like I'm going to start the game with Shura Whirlwind, or I'm going to start the game with Gref or Vayu, and both of these are very broken, especially when you have deck dev, main deck, Trap Dust, Shoot, Mind Crush, looking to close things out as early as turn 1, make it so the opponent doesn't even get a chance to play the game. I think this variant of the deck is very good. I think I'm willing to put this type of hybrid Blackwing deck in S tier. I think it does everything that the other two variants are doing, but it does it better, and without all the bricks from Vayu. Like, it's like all of the strengths and other weaknesses. It's fucking Blade, you know what I'm talking about? That's what's up with this variant of Blackwings. Like, it's like you get the Shura Whirlwind starts that the traditional Blackwing deck has, and then you also get the Vayu Greffer starts, and then you also get like main deck dev, Mind Crush stuff. I think that that's a very solid approach to the deck. I think that moving forward, we could see this deck adopting cards like Phoenix Wing Wind Blast even, but even the version that top 8'd RBET2, I think is a very solid S tier deck, and I'm happy to put it there for now. So that's it for the Blackwing stuff. Next up, let's talk about Aliens a little bit. Aliens, I think this deck, the biggest issue with this deck is it's restricted in deck building. Cosmic Fortress Golgar is a very good card. It's a very, very good card. And I think that the ability this deck has to play all of these various like niche floodgates that do a very good job at answering different metagames and adapting in that sense, it makes it very strong. So I think it's a very strong like anti-meta deck. If there's a very known meta going into a tournament, kind of like how there was for RBET2, you could build your alien deck to have the right floodgates for that. But I think because the metagame in Edison is so diverse, it's so complex, and it's very hard to read exactly what your matchups are going to be and pick the right floodgates, I think this is like it's a solid C tier deck, but I don't think it's on the same level as the B or A tier decks. You can do well with, well, I guess I should describe the tiers a little bit. S tier is like, you should expect to do well with this deck. Most matchups are really, really good. You have a strong proactive game plan. You're looking at just like having more powerful cards in your deck than your opponent. The A tier is like similar but a little weaker. B tier is like solid, but you're gonna have to get a little bit of luck. And then C tier is like you're gonna need not only a little bit of luck, specific metagame, but your deck is also restricted in the way that you can build it. I think one of the biggest things in the top 3 tiers is like how well these decks can adapt and switch over to different power cards and switch over to different strategies, even mid-match. The lower tier stuff are strategies that are very reliant on specific stuff sticking, specific stuff happening, and you'll notice that sort of trend. All right, next up, Diva Hero. Diva Hero, well, it did underperform at RBET2, and I think that's just because everyone was gunning for it, but I do think Diva Hero is still an S tier deck. I still think it's one of the best tiers or best decks in Edison format. There was 2 copies in RBET1 top 8. We've seen a lot of really, really talented players take it to repeated tops, and it didn't necessarily, I guess, underperform in a sense that Absolute Zero decks were still killing it at RBET2, but it wasn't specifically the Diva Hero deck, and I think that's just because people were gunning for this. They practiced that matchup, whatever. I think it's still an S tier deck. I think it can still adapt to certain metagames. I think it can still adapt, and good players could still take this to a top 8 finish very easily. But I do think it's a little bit worse than how I had it ranked before RBET1. Yeah, I'm pretty confident putting it in S tier. I'm going to be honest. Okay, next up, Dimensional Fissure, Macrocosmos tile decks. I think this deck it's like Aliens, but worse. I think Dimensional Fissure, Macrocosmos style decks are inherently flawed in that drawing multiple copies of D-Fissure and Macrocosmos are bricks, total bricks, and you really can't afford that in this format. Like, every copy of D-Fissure past the first is a -1, and the first one is also technically a -1 if your opponent doesn't have any graveyard stuff going on. So you're taking a risk on the card actually affecting your opponent's strategy, and then on top of that, you're overloading on these types of cards and hoping that the advantage you get from stuff like DD Scalplane and DD Survivor is enough, when you could just honestly put a Treeborn Frog in your deck and accomplish all of that with one card. So I think that the D-Fissure decks are quite bad. I can't recommend playing stuff like Macro Monarchs or like Gren Maju Control or like Guardian Eauto style decks. The only exception is maybe D-Fissure Glads, but even that, you have to have a pretty specific metagame, and I think the D-Fissures are arguably just like not as good as some of the other stuff you could be playing in those decks. Anyway. Alright, next up, Hero Beat. Hero Beat is a really, really solid strategy. I honestly didn't give this deck enough credit when we were first looking at the format last year. It's done a pretty good job of consistently hitting top 8 in both RBET1 and RBET2. Absolute Zero is a very powerful card. Absolute Zero is a very powerful card. Elemental Hero Captain Gold is a powerful inclusion that helps you deal with monsters that normally just ran over Alias or power crept it. And I think in general, like Gemini Spark and Hero Blast are really solid interactive pieces. So I'm going to put it in A tier. I think it's about as good as the Vayu deck. It has a few notable flaws. I think the biggest notable flaw is that the deck is inherently very weak to hard monster removal. So if your monsters are getting banished, you really only have like 6 monsters in your deck to win the game with. And once people realize that that's the strat, they'll just ignore your back row and focus on removing your monsters. And similar to Blackwings, a little bit less so because you have Miracle Fusions, but similar to Blackwings, you are very reliant on your normal summon sticking for anything to happen. So I think it's like a slightly better version of Blackwings in the current metagame because Hero Blast and Gemini Spark are so good, and because Miracle Fusion Absolute Zero is so good, it prevents you from getting reversaled. Plus, you get to play, obviously, all the same floodgates that Blackwings get to play. You get to play Oppression, Skill Drain, and all that. But I don't think it's quite an S tier deck compared to these other decks up here. One of the biggest things about these S tier decks, too, is like how well these decks can play Phoenix Wing Wind Blast, how well they can play Regeki Break, how well they can play the generic overpowered removal that requires a very heavy cost, which is a discard. I think that once you get into the decks that can functionally support those cards, that's when you're starting to see like the S tier strategies for sure. Those unconditional spot removal spells, those are the cards that really help you interact with anything, help your deck take on any sort of threat, and help you be a lot more versatile than some of the other stuff like lower down here, like the Ancient Gear deck can't really afford to play stuff like Phoenix and Wind Blast, the Alien deck, etc., etc. So moving on, we've got X-Sabers, which is honestly, it's a deck that I've always given a lot of respect to. I've lost to it a couple times. I've beaten it a lot of times, but when I lose to it, it looks very broken. And it's one of those decks where it's like when you lose to it, you're like, geez, how does anyone ever beat this deck? But they kind of just fall short. It kind of just falls short. Like, the results with this deck have been middling at the very least. They lose to 1 or 2 pieces of interaction if they can't break through it. There's a lot of awkward draws with the deck where you're drawing like either multiple normal summons that are just weak, or you're drawing multiple fall trolls with no way to convert them. Rescue Cat doesn't quite do exactly what it does in later formats with Dark Soul and Boggart Knight being legal, so I think this deck is actually quite underwhelming. Despite the good draws looking as powerful as they look, the average draw of the deck is just not consistent enough for it to compete at a high level, or for me to put it in the B tier like I have in the past. I've always been hesitant to put this deck low because I know it can do a lot of really broken stuff, and I'm sure there is a build out there that's like pretty solid, but it's generally speaking a C tier deck. Okay, next up is a deck that Was nerfed in the 2010 March ban list significantly, and has been kind of like one of these decks where we think it's good, but we're not really sure. And now I am pretty darn sure. I think Zombies is a solid S tier deck. I think especially because of the way the metagame is right now, where everything is trying to rely on these like unconditional, like generic removals, like Phoenix Wing Windblast, plus a graveyard strategy. That's where Zombies really thrives. Goblin Zombie is really good when everyone's playing like Regeki breaks and whatnot. Goblin Zombie also helps you support your own Regeki breaks, your own Phoenix Wing Windblast. Book of Life is just exceptional in this metagame. It can OTK you out of nowhere. It has very strong OTK potential. It can play all of the best cards in the game. Darkarm Dragon, Burial. It can play Brain Control, Mind Control to the fullest effect. It's very good with Trap Does Shoot. It's very good with like Caius. So it's got all of the tools to be the best deck in Edison format. And I think it's definitely up there with the other S tier contenders as of right now. All right, next up, Six Samurai. Six Samurai is like a very, very bad Blackwing deck. I'm going to put it in D tier, just because it's kind of interesting, right? It's like, do you ever have a reason to play Six Samurai over Blackwing? That's what you have to ask yourself. Yes, you do get a third Gateway, so you get a third Whirlwind effect, and you do get Six Samurai United, which are both very good cards. Don't get me wrong. But at the cost of all of your monsters being dog shit terrible. And, of course, you're limited to your normal summon. So I think it's a very, very bad deck. I can't recommend anyone ever playing this at a competitive level. If someone has success with it in the future, I'll eat my words, but I just don't see that happening. Next, Gravekeepers. Gravekeepers, I think, is actually in a really good spot in the metagame. I think there needs to be a list that is refined to the point where it's consistent. You're not like okay, here's what I'm trying to say is like Phoenix Wing Windblast, Regeki Break is the metagame. Sticking a Floodgate in that metagame is quite difficult. There are ways to do that in the Gravekeeper deck. There's ways to make sure your Necro Valley sticks around and prevents your opponent's like Broken Vayu, Miracle Fusion, Mizuki shenanigans. But I think that someone needs to find the right list. And as of right now, no one really has the right list. So I'm going to put Gravekeepers. I'm going to put it above Salvo and Ancient Gear. Actually, let me rearrange this B tier a little bit. I think regular Blackwings with Black Whirlwind is the top of B tier. I think Gravekeepers is right underneath that. And then I think the Salvo deck and the Ancient Gear deck is somewhere around here. But yeah, I think the Gravekeeper deck needs to be perfected, needs to be tuned a little bit more. It hasn't been tuned enough. So that's where it's going to be. Next up, Gladiator Beasts. Man, I love and hate this deck, right? It's fucking trash, but it's really good at the same time. And it gatekeeps a lot of stuff. I think it does a pretty good job against some of the unfair stuff. You can adapt the deck list to do well for different metagames. It is a little normal summon reliant, like Blackwings. So I am going to put it in B tier. And I'm going to put it below Gravekeepers. But I do think it's a very good deck. I do not want to discredit this deck too much. I think there are lists that aren't as normal summon reliant that do much better. But overall, it's just got the same issues that the other like slower aggro decks have. And on top of that, you can't even play Royal Oppression. So it's weaker than Blackwings for sure. Similar issues. Very powerful deck. Don't underestimate it or it will beat you. Definitely prepare for it or it will beat you. But in general, very, very weak. Very weak deck. Just kidding. Just kidding. I love it. It's very powerful, but also just terrible. Just trash deck. Just can't. Next up, Lightsworns. We got Lightsworns. All right. Lightsworns did very well in RBET2, but that's because they were like smoke screening into a Vayu deck. And did they do well because they were a Vayu deck, or did they do well because they were a Lightsworn deck? That's really what I'm thinking. And of course, the players piloting it were just exceptionally skilled. The Disciples is a very powerful team. They have a lot of strength in that, and I think Lightsworn can also adapt in a way that some of these other decks can't adapt. I do think it's a little bit pigeonholed. You need to play a certain number of Lightsworn names. Playing trap cards is not very good for it because they're mediocre mills. JD is a little bit restrictive in a deck building sense. So it's not as adaptive as maybe something like Diva Hero or Zombies or the hybrid Blackwing decks. But I do think it's like as powerful, if not more powerful than the Vayu deck. And I definitely think it's better than the Hero Beat deck overall. The ceiling is just really high with this deck. You can have turns. There was a match that was for top 8 of RBET2 that didn't get shown on camera, but it was absolutely disgusting. Marcus played a Charge of the Light Brigade, milled a Wolf, sacked it for Celestia, milled 2 more Wolves, and just won on the first turn of the game because he hit all 4 Lightsworn names too and was able to summon JD. And it's just like, you can do stuff with the Lightsworn deck like that that's just like really unfair. The ceiling is so high for this deck compared to some of these other decks that need like, I don't know, like even just milling 1 Wolf can just kill so many of these decks down here. So I think that the ceiling being that high, I think the general power level of each of the cards being that high is very good. Honest is a very broken card. JD's a very broken card. And I think the versatility in the post board, being able to smoke screen and stuff like Vayu, that's really sick. So I think it's got to be a solid A tier deck. Can't really put it in S tier just because we haven't seen it. I don't know. It has its own issues, right? It's very inconsistent. Sometimes you just brick on Wolves. Sometimes you just brick on certain things. But that's just the nature of the deck. High ceiling, low floor, and a lot of power in that deck. So it's got to be an A tier deck for me. Next up is like the Switch Control, Lava Golem type decks. I think these decks are along the same lines as, I'd say, low C tier, high D tier. Once your opponent knows how to play against it, it becomes a significantly worse strategy. And that's the issue, right? Is good players will adapt. So tier lists are kind of looking at things like that you're going to want to bring to a tournament. If you're expecting to enter a tournament and you're expecting your opponents to be bad past round 1, you're mistaken. A lot of the players playing Edison format are very skilled. They know what's up. They know how to play around certain things. They know how to play around certain like situations. They've been playing this game for almost 2 decades now. You can't really mix people up too much past round 1. So I do think it's a really cool strategy. I think there's a lot of unique combos in it, like compulsory evacuation device plus lava golem. That's very underexplored as just like a build your own Icarus attack type effect. But yeah, ultimately it's a little bit too fragile. It's a little bit too easy to just play around that. So yeah. Along those same lines, alt win decks, I'm kind of lumping them all together because most of them are just reliant on drawing Morphing Jar, if we're going to be honest. And that being the case, I'm just going to put them in D tier. I think they are much better. Well, maybe low C tier. I think they are much better than these 2 decks in D tier. So yeah, I guess we'll just put them in C tier. I think stuff like Chain Burn, stuff like what's that other deck? Empty Jar, like fucking what is the other deck? Final Countdown. Yeah, these decks low C tier. Solid decks, but just not consistent enough. They run out of gas too easily. They can lose to just a well-timed Phoenix Wing Wind Blast from some of the better decks. They get OTK'd if they stumble at all. It's not really where I'd want to be in this metagame. I think Chain Burn might be a little bit higher than some of the other ones. I haven't really explored that deck enough. But in general, alt win, pretty low. Similarly, but not quite similarly, Norlaris Dragons. I think this is a very good deck. I think it's a solid B tier strategy. Norlaris is a ridiculous effect, and if you resolve it, it's just nasty. It is a little linear, does lose a bit hard to certain things like DD Crow and Kaiku and whatnot, but I mean it's a solid strategy, and the dragon cards are very broken. We'll get into those in a second, but yeah, they kind of hard carry the deck if we're going to be honest, and I think it's about as good as Ancient Gear, maybe a little bit worse, maybe a little bit better. It's a cheese deck. If you think people are slimming on DD Crows, if you think people are slimming on Kaikus or Graveyard Hate, it can be very strong. Or you could just high roll people in turn 1 Norlaris and just pray they don't have it. Next up, Quickdraw. Quickdraw has always been one of those decks where it's just like, this is old reliable, you know? It's solid. You got the best removal. You got the best reverse toolbox with Drill Warrior. You got the most options. You can pretty much add whatever you want to this deck. And I think the newer versions are moving more towards being less normal summon reliant, which is really cool. I'm down to put Quickdraw in A tier. I think it does a pretty good job at adapting to different metagames. I think it does a pretty good job at dealing with certain stuff. I've tried a lot of different variants of Quickdraw lately, and I've had just a lot of fun playing the deck. I think it's a cool deck. If you're newer to the format, pick this up. I think it's a great deck for learning the format. I think it's a great deck for learning basic interactions, learning how to play the game better. I think it's just a solid deck overall. I think it's slightly better than Blackwings, Gravekeepers, and Glads right now. This is obviously subject to change, but I think it's like a bottom of A tier deck as of right now. Because of the way it matches up against the top tier decks, the way it can utilize stuff like DD Crow, and also because of just the adaptability of the deck, it can also play the Regeki Breaks, the Phoenix Wing Wind Blasts. It can also like shift its strategy to be more along those lines. All right, next up, I mentioned them a little bit earlier, and we're going to get into it. Dragons. There's a lot of things to cover with dragons here. I think in general, dragons are a very high S tier strategy. Very, very, very broken deck in general. A little bit underrepresented by the field, and that's understandable. The deck is, I wouldn't say it's the most fun deck to play. It has a lot of really cool interactions, unique stuff, but some games you just Future Fusion, you roll over your opponent, and that's like, I can understand why someone wouldn't want to play that. It can play all of the broken discard traps if it wants to. It can play Regeki Break, Wind Blasts. I mean, you have high value discards in like Wyvern, Whitestone, depending on your build. You can play a wide variety of builds. All of the dragon monsters, White Knight Dragon, Light Darkness Dragon, Prime Material Dragon even, Red Eyes Darkness Metal Dragon, all these cards are just straight up better than most of the Synchros in the format. And so you just have these like built-in, really busted monsters that outclass everything your opponent is doing. The only thing this deck lacks that some of these other decks have is the ability to abuse Bryonic. I think once you can figure out a way for the Dragon deck to abuse Bryonic and the discard traps a little bit more, it just becomes a clear best deck in the format. It also has a little bit of issues with Absolute Zero, which is obviously the most powerful finisher in the format right now, the most resilient like late game card, and the most common one as well. So you do have to have a plan for that if you're playing this deck, but overall, like, you can't deny like how insane it is to resolve a Future Fusion with this deck. It's just insane. Like that's probably the best thing you can do in the format. Like one card on turn one, not even close. I think there's very few things that even come close to that. So yeah, I gotta put it in S tier for that reason alone. And Red Eyes Darkness Metal is just broken as shit. If you've played the deck, you know. If you played the deck, you know. Plus it has like Drago, and Drago is just like a 1900 Fossil Dyna against all of these decks. Like, it's pretty insane. I'd be hard pressed to put it anywhere but S tier. It's shown a little bit of like, I'm lumping all these decks together, right? I'm lumping the Turbo and the Trap Dragon, and I'm lumping the hybrid versions of that with like Quickdraw and stuff. I'm lumping them all together and just saying like Red Eyes Future Fusion decks. This also kind of encapsulates the Norlaris deck a little bit. There's like a Venn diagram overlap of that. But I think if your deck has Red Eyes and Future Fusion in it, and that's the focus of your deck, you're looking at an S tier deck, unless you're diluting it with stuff like Norlaris or you're diluting it with stuff like Quickdraw, then it can weaken it. I think the more like pure versions are much stronger. Okay. What's next? Relinquished. Relinquished is a cool deck. I want to see more of this. I know it's got some buffs in the format due to some rulings. I think if you priority take a monster and your opponent chains book to Relinquish, it still kills the monster. Which is a pretty solid buff. I think it has some merit in the quick draw strategies. I'm going to put it in high C tier, low B tier. It has no results as of right now, but in theory, it can do everything that these decks are doing, but not be as normal summon reliant. And it can also play cards like Royal Decree or Secret Village of the Spellcasters, just like really weird, broken cards that not other decks can play that effectively. I think this is an underdeveloped deck. I think as more people start to develop it, it could honestly be more of an A tier or high B tier strategy. But for now, I'm going to put it in low B tier. I think it is better than all of these decks in the C tier. I would rather play something like Quickdraw Relinquished than like X-Sabers in a tournament. But it's marginal. It's a little bit marginal. All right, next up, Rescue Cat Synchro. Rescue Cat Synchro. There's a lot of different variants of this deck, and I think all of the variants are very cool, and I think all of the variants are very dependent on you seeing Rescue Cat and not drawing too many Airbellums. So it's going to go in the worse than X-Saber tier. Worse than that. But I don't know. It's probably worse than Chainbird. Not by much, though. Probably rather play it than here. Let's put Altwin up here. This makes more sense. Let's put Altwin over Rescue Cat over, what is this? Switch Control. Yeah, let's do this. That looks about right to me. I think Rescue Cat is better than the Switch Control decks because you can Synchro Summon, which gives you a lot more options and versatility. But I do think it's a weaker and slower deck overall. All right, next up is a deck I'm pretty sure a lot of you guys want to hear me talk about, and it's Frogs. I am lumping all the Frog decks together in that they should all be Frog Hero decks from this point on. I don't think there's any reason to play traditional Frog Monarchs over Frog Hero. I don't think there's any reason to play Diva Frog over Frog Hero. I think that Frog Hero is just the best version of that. Miracle Fusion is broken. Stratos 1-for-1 is broken. And I think that this is a solid S tier deck. You could put it... Well, we'll rearrange the S tier in a second, but I think it's a very strong S tier deck. And that was showcased expertly in RBET2 by the creator of the powerful list, Raunuk, and Cameron Saunders. They... both members of Team Ring of Destruction did an exceptional job at showcasing why this is one of the best decks, if not the best deck in the format. You get access to Rise of Caius, which is just disgusting. You get access to all the discard traps. I believe they were playing upwards of 6 discard traps in their deck, which is like fucking wild. You get the best Subsitode broken card in the format. You know, you get a full suite of that, access to all those synergies and benefits. You get to play 1-for-1, which is a broken card every time it's doing something broken. You get to play triple Miracle Fusion, which if you guys play GOAT format or if you guys play other formats, Miracle Fusion is kind of like the Chaos Sorcerer of this format, is how I would like to put it. It's kind of like I banish 2 monsters and I summon something broken that it's very functionally the same as Chaos Sorcerer. It's a little bit more restrictive on your deck building, but they found a really, really great way to do that in including like Stratos plus Malicious and whatnot. So I think the Hero Frog deck, alongside with these other S tier decks, gets to play the discard traps, gets to play the best boss monster, gets to play triple Caius to its fullest extent, just gets to play all the best cards in the format, and it does it in a very unfair way. So very solid deck. Very, very solid deck. Also gets to abuse Treeborn Frog better than I think any other deck, which... Man, Treeborn Frog is so good. It's so good. It's like the Sinister Serpent of this format, but it's almost better in a lot of ways. So I think it's very good. One thing that I would like to see in this deck moving forward is them teching maybe 1 or 2 copies of Enemy Controller. I think that would just push the deck over the top because all of a sudden you're playing more than 1 copy of Brain Control, which is another one of the best cards in the format. So yeah. Along the same lines, the Coelacanth combo deck. I have a list of this deck, which... I'm going to leak here in this video that does play the hero stuff as well. And I think that list is quite good. But I think the traditional fish deck, where it's just like, I hope to get my fish combo, I hope to draw Coelacanth and win the game, that deck sucks. I think it's really bad. I think it's like around the same tier as Rescue Cat, right? Probably a little bit better than X-Saber, maybe, just because Subsitode's so broken. But... if you're playing the traditional list of it, C tier. If you're playing the updated hero list of it, might even be a B or A tier deck. I don't know. It's underexplored right now to include the hero stuff in a fish combo deck, but I could see it happening. I could see something wild like that where you have an absolute 0 A plan and then your B plan is just Armory Arm Colossal OTK. I could see that being quite nasty. Malicious also gives you an easy... like D-draw target in that deck, and you can also like use it as a second tribute fodder at any point for your Coelacanth. That's something the deck struggled with a lot before. You can also utilize Instant Fusion for Elemental Hero Mariner in that list. If you go something like Tribute Absolute 0 for Super Ancient Deep Sea King Coelacanth, you can like nuke your opponent's board if they have like a bunch of problematic stuff like Thunder King or Titanial that normally hinders the combo. I think that the hero version of this deck is much better. It's much more resilient. It also lets you play Caius a little bit better. But I do think that the older versions of the deck that weren't adapting the new technology are pretty bad. And I do think this deck suffers from some of the issues that Vayu suffers from in that it has a lot of bricks, which are bad. All right, next up is a deck that I wanted to include because I saw a few people playing it in RBET2, and I played it a lot recently. It's just pure plants. It's like no quick draw, just more like plant engine. You do get to play the Caiuses and stuff, but you focus more on like the plant stuff. You focus more on debris. I think this deck is it's pretty solid. It's about as good as I'd say Gladiator Beasts. It's very normal summon reliant. Unlike quick draw, you can build it in a way to not be that, but nobody's really figured that out. I think one of the biggest upsides to this deck over something like Glads or Gravekeepers is that even though you are normal summon reliant, even though you are weak to oppression, you do get to play the discard traps, which are, of course, a recurring theme of this. You do get to play them very effectively. I think being able to discard something like a Night Assailant or discard something like a Dandelion or even just discard a Titanial and bring it back with like a Miracle Fertilizer or something, that's quite good. It's quite good. You could also adapt this list to play stuff like Gigaplant, kind of lumping Gigaplant into this. I think Gigaplant is an interesting card, and I think there's some cool stuff you can do with that, including the discard traps as well. All right, next up is a deck that I've played a few times on the channel, but no one else has played ever in any of the tournaments ever, and that's Uria Control with the floodgates and whatnot. This is like Aliens, but just worse. I think it's around the same level as Aliens, but probably a little bit worse than Fish and Rescue Cat, along the same lines as the Switch control decks. Probably is where I'd put it. It's a solid deck. If you can hit the right floodgates and if you have the right configuration, it can do some stuff. But it's very restrictive in your deck building. You don't get to play a lot of the better cards in the format. You don't get to abuse a lot of the better synergies in the format. And you're kind of just hoping that your floodgates get you to a 3,000 or 6,000 Uria that sticks around. And it's just not very reliable in a format where Absolute Zero is the premier monster that people are ending on. Okay, next up, Volcanic stuff. This is going to kind of encapsulate the Volcanic Quickdraw and the Volcanic Garden decks, and I think these decks are very solid control decks. I think, where am I going with this? I think they're very solid control decks. I think they're pretty, how do I say this? Depends on your build, right? Depends on your build. You need a way to cheat on normal summons. You do need a way to cheat on normal summons. But if you build it in a way where you're like trying to turtle up and then Blaze Accelerator your opponent out of the game, I showcased a list, an adaptation of Tyler Nolan's list on the channel a few weeks ago. And I think that list is very solid. I know James Ark has done some stuff with Volcanic Quickdraw, and I think his list is very solid. I think there's a lot of merit to this deck. I think it's very slept on. It does pretty well against some of these high tier decks as well. I think as long as you're packing enough defense, enough battle faders, enough ways to make sure you don't get OTK'd, because you really have to factor in that you're starting the game at less life points than your opponent because of Volcanic Shell, because of the nature of that. I'm hesitant to put it in A tier. I want to. It just doesn't quite have the results right now. I do think it is better than all of these decks here. I think it's a little bit better than the Salvo deck. Arguably better than the Debris Hime deck. I am going to put it below Gravekeepers and Glads and Blackwings, like the traditional Blackwings, and that's based off of results alone. I think this deck could have results in the future. I think it's a very good deck. I think it could easily earn its spot in A or S tier just because of the nature of Volcanic Shell plus the discard traps specifically. But as of right now, it's got to be in B tier just because of its showing. Next up, Yellow Baboon. Fuck Yellow Baboon. This is F tier deck. Going in the F tier. Fuck this deck. I never want to play this deck ever again if I could. Ew. You know, I always say it's my favorite deck. This is my least favorite deck. I fucking hate that deck. Never play it again. All right, next up, gadgets. Gadgets are interesting, right? Because like you'll randomly lose to it here and there, but the deck sucks. And it's boring as shit. And it's very linear. You can't really do much with it. Yes, you can play the discard traps, but then you have to discard your monster stream. And your monsters are going to get run over by battle. You are going to lose your monsters unless you're playing Solidarity, which is like limiting to what you can include in your deck. I'm very hesitant to put this deck above C tier, so I'm going to put it in C tier. It also has 0 results as of right now. It just hasn't done anything. I know that a lot of people have an affinity for this deck. I know that a lot of people say it's a busted deck. But honestly, if your opponent's playing well, they're never going to lose to you. That's just how it goes. If you're summoning a yellow gadget in 2022, you really got some thinking to do. I'll say it. It's probably better than Golgar and Fall Troll just because the deck can randomly cheese people, but I don't think it's good enough to include in the top 3 tiers. All right, next up, Fairies. Here's where I'm going to make a bit of a biased statement. I think this is an S tier deck. I think this is an S tier deck, like, by a lot. I think Archlord Christia is broken as fuck. It's just such an auto win against all of these decks in the A and S tier. Fairies has no real bad matchups outside of Gravekeepers. Gravekeepers is like a near auto loss matchup. And I also think it doesn't do well against the D-Fissure decks, specifically D-Fissure Glads. I think that really beat up on Fairies. Fairies can get hated out very easily, but I do think it is just straight up a better deck than these in the A tier. It has the results. It doesn't quite have the representation, but it usually overperforms based off of the representation. ProStorm took it to, was it top 8 or top 4 in RBET1 and earned his invite with it. I think it's a really disgusting deck. Naturally, it doesn't have some of the strengths of these other 5, which is it doesn't get to play Phoenix Wing Windblast. It doesn't get to play, what's that other card? Regeki Break. Doesn't get to play those cards. It doesn't get to play Miracle Fusion. It doesn't really get to adapt too much of its deck. Well, this is open to debate. I think that you could adapt this deck a lot of different ways, and it would be really powerful in a lot of different ways. But I think Archlord Christia is just so fucking broken that, like, it doesn't matter. Like, literally, like, there are so many games where you just summon an Archlord Christia and your opponent's deck is invalidated. Yes, this deck does get weaker because all of these decks are playing the discard traps, but you can just adapt to that. And if your opponent's spending 2 cards to out your Shining Angel and you're playing a control deck, you're winning. You're winning. You're getting the 2-for-1 that you wanted. Fairies can also play Royal Oppression. It's one of the best decks in the top 10 or so that can play Royal Oppression. I think the only other deck that plays it better is Vayu and maybe Lightsworn. Fairies is also very, very consistent. Your average draws are going to be very similar game to game. So it's mostly about how you play the deck, and you're going to get you're not going to get like variance out of the game that often, which I think most decks below this have that weakness. You're just going to have games where, like with Vayu, where you just draw double Vayu, Plague, Necrogardener, and you just can't fucking do anything, and your opponent runs you over. Or you're going to have games with Lightsworn where you draw a double Wolf JD in your opener, and your opponent stops your normal summon. Or you're going to have games with, like, fucking Gravekeeper where you just don't see Necro Valley, and your deck falls apart. So I think Fairies is just one of those decks where it's like, it's very consistent. You see what you want to see when you want to see it. That's like a huge upside to playing this deck. And Archlord Christia is just dumb broken. I honestly want to say Archlord Christia is the 3rd best boss monster in the format, underneath Bryonic and Red Eyes Darkness Metal. I think Christia is the 3rd best. But there's arguments to putting Absolute Zero above Christia. It just depends, right? I think it just depends. It's a little bit easier to summon Absolute Zero than it is to summon Christia, which I think is the reason why it's probably better. But yeah, it's a very strong deck. Very strong deck. Every time I queue up with this deck, I just feel like I can't lose. It's so good. It has a few notable weaknesses. Don't get me wrong. Every deck up here has some notable weaknesses, but if you dodge those, you have a favorable matchup against everything. And then last but not least, a deck I know many of you have seen me rank in tier lists before. You've seen me hate on it. You've seen me talk shit. You've seen me call it F tier before. You've seen me call it trash. You've seen me call it unplayable. And this deck is, of course, the Fire 200, the Flamvells. And I'm gonna, you know what? I'm gonna say something a little bit wild. I'm gonna say something a little bit crazy for all the Flamvell fans out there. I think this is an A tier deck. I think it's a really strong deck right now. I think it does pretty well against all the other strategies in the S and A tier. I think it's really, really powerful in that the metagame's getting more defined. It's getting more focused on graveyard stuff. You can add the right tech cards to help improve your strategy. I think it can play all the discard traps very well. It can play Phoenix Wing Windblast and Regeki Break. Discard those Magicians you draw. Set up for your Rekindlings. It's got a very powerful late game finisher in Rekindling. It's got access to all the Synchros, which of course is a great thing. It's got Flamvell Fire Dog, which beats up on everyone who's starting with normal summon Stratos, or beats up on everyone who's starting with normal summon Lila, or maybe even like just fucking normal summon Lumina, Garoth. You know, it beats up on all this stuff. Beats up on, well, it doesn't really beat up on the Fairy deck. I think the Fairy deck fucking destroys Flamvells, but it does eat Shining Angels, right? It does net a bonus off the Shining Angel. Whether or not that's a good thing, is arguable, because let's say you attack with the Flamvell Fire Dog, you get the Magician, they just get another Shining Angel, then they crash with your Magician, they get a DD Warrior Lady, they banish your Fire Dog, and it trades 1-for-1 with Shining Angel theoretically in a vacuum, but it does get its effect off very easily against that deck. And I think that's where we're gonna end things with this tier list. I think this is a pretty solid definitive tier list. Oh wait, let's rearrange the S tier. Let's rearrange the S tier with what I actually think. So I think the deck to beat is Diva Hero. Diva Hero is the deck to beat. Same thing with Frog Hero. I think these are the two decks to beat. If your deck can beat those, then your deck is doing great. These are going to be the most played decks in the coming months, most likely. I think Zombies does a very good job against these decks. I think Dragons also does a very good job against these decks. I think the Blackwing decks and the Fairy decks can do all right against these decks. I think they struggle a little bit more than Dragons and Zombies in these matchups, but I do think that they have a shot. I think Christia is obviously very insane. It's a little bit more difficult to stick Christia through 6 discard traps, but there are some innovations in the Fairy list that I will get into in a later video that make it so you're not so weak to the discard traps. And yeah, I think that's that. I think that this is probably how I would order things. Maybe the Blackwings above this. Yeah, the hybrid Blackwings is probably a little bit better than Fairies right now. Yeah, and Lightsworn could honestly be up here too, I think. But it just depends on how hot the player is running. And it also depends on their sideboard and their ability to metagame a little bit more than these 6 decks where you can just bring a stock list and expect to do well as long as you play perfectly. Yeah, this looks pretty solid. This is Edison format, March 2022, the end of March 2022. I'm excited to see where it goes. There's a lot of new decks that I wanted to put on here, but honestly just couldn't because they're just too new. They're just too new to even talk about right now. And we've seen some new decks in the last few months. We've seen the Frog Hero deck, and we've seen the Ancient Gear deck, and then Orlaris deck make an appearance, as well as stuff like Flamvells moving up in the ranks, I think is really cool. The hybrid Blackwing decks we've seen a lot more of. And I'm just excited to see where it goes. Let me know what you guys expect to see in the coming months, and leave a like and subscribe again. Peace out, everyone.